From Cafe, welcome to Stay Tuned. I'm Preet Bharara.
Almost anything is beautiful if you see, wow, this has implications on how the universe works, which is, from the day we were sentient, we're like, how does this thing work? This puzzle that we have found ourselves born into. And every topic is answering that question in some way, shape, or form.
That's Sal Khan. He's the founder of Khan Academy, the online education nonprofit. I speak with him about the state of learning in America, what technology can and can't do in education, and disappointing our South Asian parents by not becoming doctors. That's coming up. Stay tuned. What is justice? How is it served? Who wields it? How is it accomplished? And when does it fail? These are some of the questions and moral quandaries that I wrestle with in my new book, Doing Justice, a prosecutor's thoughts on crime, punishment, and the rule of law. It came out just 2 weeks ago, and to the great relief of my mom and dad, it debuted at number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. That's kind of unexpected and feels pretty good. Thank you to all who have shown your support. Doing Justice is about the stories and timeless principles that can help us understand this moment in history. I hope you'll order your copy, also available as an audiobook, at doingjusticebook.com. Now let's get to your questions.
Hi, Preet. This is Natasha. I'm a grad student in Pennsylvania. And one of my questions is, previously you've talked about the respect that you have for Rod Rosenstein. I'm just a little bit confused about the role that Rosenstein played in having any input into what Barr wrote, because in his summary, I think that he referenced that both he and Rosenstein had kind of come to these conclusions. So kind of that division of who's actually responsible and what role Rod Rosenstein played in that, I would like a little bit of clarification on, because so far it seems like the focus has mostly been on Barr and there hasn't really been much discussion about that. Thanks. Looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll listen for this on the podcast. All right. Bye.
Hey, Natasha. Thanks for your question. So Rod Rosenstein is sort of an interesting figure in all of this, and I think will be an interesting figure when the postmortems on all this are done. As people may know, I know him. We work together as United States attorneys, he in Baltimore, I in the Southern District of New York. So let me say at the outset, he's a smart, disciplined, thoughtful, capable lawyer. I think the legacy of his involvement in all of the business of the last 2 years is a little bit mixed. Remember, it was Rod Rosenstein who wrote that memo at the request of the president, setting forth reasons why Jim Comey could be fired, none of which were the reasons why Donald Trump actually fired Jim Comey. Anybody who thinks that is living on a different planet. The idea that Donald Trump fired Jim Comey because he didn't treat Hillary Clinton well or color within the lines ethically with respect to Hillary Clinton is, as I've said, living on a planet, maybe not a planet even in the solar system. So, Rod Rosenstein allowed himself, best case scenario, to be used in that instance. But then, after 8 or 9 days of blowback in which he was vilified, and I think fairly legitimately so, he appointed Bob Mueller. And he's the only reason we have Bob Mueller. And whether you think that's right or wrong, that was a pretty important statement and a pretty important development. And then throughout the pendency of the Mueller investigation, it was Rod Rosenstein who stood by it, defended it, said it wasn't a witch hunt. But that leads to an interesting conundrum on the question of his role in doing the summary of the Mueller report and in being involved in the assessment of whether or not obstruction was committed and the description of obstruction, and making the decision along with the Attorney General to say there was no obstruction, having reviewed the Mueller report, which did not make such a conclusion. Remember, the Mueller report is sort of agnostic on it, says we can't state that a crime was committed, we can't state that a crime was not committed, the president is not exonerated. All of that is odd because Rod Rosenstein, from what it looks like from the outside, was a little bit of a witness on the obstruction matter. He's the one who observed things that the president did. He had apparently conversations with the president, and all throughout the pendency of the investigation, it seemed odd to me that he's a person who has a potential conflict of interest and might have needed to recuse himself. That never happened, in part, and maybe it's legitimate, but I just don't know. But that didn't happen in part because no Democrats ever clamored for it. Nobody ever said Rod Rosenstein doesn't belong involved in the investigation or overseeing it because he is a material witness in some way to the obstruction. And the reason for that, and that's also understandable, is that Democrats in Congress, and I've talked to folks who have said this, felt that Rod Rosenstein, for all intents and purposes, was one of the good defenders of the Mueller investigation. And remember, people were always worried that Rod Rosenstein was going to be fired, and he was on the wrong side of Donald Trump. There was a moment when he was summoned to the White House, and everyone breathlessly reported that he was about to be canned because of his defense of the Mueller investigation, and the president was mad at him about that. So people looked at him as a defender of that investigation, so didn't raise questions about conflict, didn't raise questions about, potentially his needing to recuse himself. So now we are in a position where people are not happy with the result. People think that Bill Barr inserted himself. I'm one of those people to basically say there was no obstruction here, along with Rod Rosenstein. It made clear in the letter that they did that together. And it's a little hard, I will say, for Democrats in the House and the Senate to complain about Rod Rosenstein's involvement, because all along, for decent reasons, they said, well, Rod Rosenstein is a defender of the investigation. So I think that's sort of interesting. And the other interesting question is, why is Rod Rosenstein still there, given that we had all this reporting that he was leaving? That's happened multiple times. Maybe he's there to help with the redactions. Maybe he's there to help deal with the litigation that may arise over the subpoena that the House Judiciary Committee just voted on to obtain the Mueller report in its entirety and testimony from some other people who were under scrutiny by Bob Mueller. That all remains to be seen. I think you're right to be asking questions about Rod Rosenstein, his role, his views. Remember, there was the other interesting thing about Rod that was reported that he denied publicly, and that is in the crazy days after Jim Comey was fired, just before Bob Mueller was appointed, the reports are that Rod Rosenstein himself at a meeting, more than one meeting, invoked the 25th Amendment and raised the prospect of wearing a wire against the president. Now, it's been suggested by some people that that was a joke. I tend to think that's not a joke, and people were really freaked out in those few days, not knowing what the president was capable of, not just because he fired Jim Comey, but also because he said truly nutty things to Russian officials in the White House, including that Jim Comey was a nut job and firing Comey gave him breathing room. It was a bit of chaos in the minds of a lot of people, including the minds of people who were handpicked appointees of the president himself. So I look forward to getting a full accounting, not just of the report, but also the roles of various people and the thoughts they had over time. When those books are written, I will read them. And if you don't have time to read them, I will summarize them for you.
Preet, this is Mike in Virginia. And you might have covered this and I missed it, but why can't Congress merely invite Robert Mueller up to the Hill to ask him questions to get better clarification about what's in the report? Thanks. Look forward to your answer. Bye-bye.
Hey, Mike, thanks for your question. So I certainly expect that Congress will invite Bob Mueller to testify. And I guess there are two categories of issue. One category legal, the other category pragmatic, strategic. So on the legal issue, Bob Mueller is subject to the same regulations that any other person, U.S. Attorney or Department of Justice official would be, depending on whether or not there are assertions of executive privilege. He would be subjected to them. The White House could intervene in some way and suggest that the scope of what he can talk about is narrowed. Bob Mueller also is an institutionalist, and to the extent there is information that he's asked about that calls for an answer that includes classified information or sensitive information about ongoing investigations, Bob Mueller will likely, unless there's some other authorization or compelling need, probably not reveal those things either. I've seen Bob Mueller testify. I think he's actually a model of what congressional testimony should be like. I saw him testify a number of times when I worked in the Senate. And he's not afraid of answering questions, but he's also not afraid to say, I can't answer it because it's not appropriate for me to do so. So, to the extent there's a gap between what Bill Barr allows to be revealed and what is appropriate to be revealed, I don't think Bob Mueller would fear going into that gap. But he's also not a person who's ostentatious and goes out of his way and says, I would love to come testify and tell you all the stories and be some kind of open book about what he did, but he will answer questions forthrightly if he's called to testify. Now, the pragmatic and practical issue is, when do you have that happen? As I've said, the House Judiciary Committee voted to approve subpoenas for a number of individuals and also the Mueller report in its entirety today, Wednesday, April 3rd. They did not subpoena Bob Mueller, and I think that makes logical sense, because I think first you want to know what you're going to get from the Mueller report so you can put intelligent, pointed questions to Bob Mueller. Also, there may be a fight about what the scope of his testimony may be, as I said in the first part. What we do know is, if you believe the representation of the Attorney General, Bill Barr, is that some version of a report is coming in a couple of weeks. It would take longer than that to have Bob Mueller come before the committee. So it seems to make sense to see, let's see what the report says. Let's see how many gaps there are. Let's see how many redactions there are. And then we will have a better idea and sense, having talked to some other witnesses and seeing some version of a report, what it makes sense to query Bob Mueller on.
Hi, Preet. It's Ryan from Ohio. I was wondering, what's going on with all this security clearance nonsense? Thanks so much. Bye.
Hey, Ryan, thanks for your question. It sounds like you said, very basically, what the hell is going on with the security clearance nonsense, which is a question that I have too. It's a question that a lot of people have. It's a question that Elijah Cummings, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, has as well, and I think will be investigating. So what you're referring to is obviously the emerging scandal. I think scandal is not too strong a word, in which it has become known through a whistleblower and other information that at least 25, I think, to 27 individuals in the White House, including Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, were granted high-level security clearances over the objection of the career people in the national security apparatus at the White House who determine these things. And by the way, also, it seems, over the objection laid out for posterity of the former White House counsel, Don McGahn, and the former White House chief of staff, John Kelly. That's not a small thing. Security clearances are a big deal. They're important. They're done in a nonpartisan way. And the idea that the president is overruling all sorts of career folks and also appointees of his, like the chief of staff and the White House counsel, to me, and I think to a lot of people, shows a lack of respect for care and proper process in the national security area. These are not things to be handed out on a whim. These are not things that are to be handed out like favors to family members. There's a reason why you have a process. There's a reason why concerns are raised. There's a reason why objections were made, and they need to be respected. And I think the whole thing needs to be looked at. And some people will undoubtedly respond, well, the president has the absolute authority to do these things, and we've been down this road before. The president has the absolute authority to nuke Canada. I'm not comparing this to nuking Canada, but the fact that the president has the authority to do something doesn't end the inquiry. In some ways, especially when you have a revitalized Congress with oversight authority, it sometimes begins the question. And it's especially galling in light of how the president operates in other areas. It's sort of like anyone who does anything good, they get rewarded in an unethical way. And if someone does something that he doesn't like or criticizes him in some way, he finds some weapon or tool to use as a cudgel against them, to punish them. That's true in the media. If he likes you and he likes your reporting, he will inappropriately tout your show or tout your network or tout your book on Twitter. No one else in government is allowed to do that. It's an ethical violation. C.E.G. Walter Schaub. If he doesn't like what you're saying, he threatens to take your White House pass away. And it doesn't matter necessarily what network you're with. It's if he likes you, you get a benefit. If he doesn't like you, he tries to punish you. And the same is true, it seems, with security clearances. You'll remember that in the context of, as we're learning, overruling all these career people and giving security clearances to people who seem not to deserve them, he has, on the other hand, on multiple occasions, wanted to withdraw the security clearances of people who happen to be his political rivals, like John Brennan. That's bad enough on its own, but against the backdrop of him overruling all sorts of people who have a better idea of these things than he does, I think it's obnoxious, and I think it's repugnant, and I think it's a problem, and I think it should be investigated. And I've heard, some talk on the part of some Republicans of taking away Adam Schiff's security clearance. It's ludicrous. National security clearances are serious things. I had to go through multiple processes, both as an assistant U.S. attorney, as a staffer in the Senate, and of course as United States attorney, to qualify for those things. Security clearances are not perks to be distributed, at holiday time to the people who you like and to be taken away from people who you think have behaved badly. This last question comes in a tweet from Eric Snyder, at @esnyder_1, who asks, at Preet Bharara, you are outwardly sanguine. How are you inwardly? Sanguine, cautious, skeptical, concerned, upset, frantic, panicked, apoplectic? #AskPreet. Eric, thank you for your question. Inside, I am a caged, feral animal, and I could explode at any moment. I'm kidding, Eric. I'm just cool in the gang. My guest this week is Sal Khan. He's the founder of the education nonprofit Khan Academy. He started out teaching one cousin over the phone, and now the videos on his site have been viewed more than 1.6 billion times. I speak with him about the inequities of the American education system, whether there's an attention crisis, and why we still study trigonometry. Sometimes, just unlocking the mysteries of the world is its own goal. That's coming up. Stay tuned. How much time do you think attorneys spend managing their legal practices, clients, and cases? As an attorney myself, I know that the answer is a lot. Thankfully, there's a better way with Clio. Clio is the secure, cloud-based legal software that makes managing and growing your firm easier. Clio automates the tedious tasks that take up your valuable time, like generating bills, maintaining endless documents, and keeping cases organized. Clio allows you to focus on the things that actually matter. Clio's easy-to-use interface makes you more productive and helps you get paid faster. And Clio's mobile app lets you access your files from wherever you are. Clio is trusted by over 150,000 legal professionals and approved by 66 bar associations and law societies worldwide. I even spoke at Clio's Cloud Conference a few years back. So take your law firm to the next level with Clio. Go to clio.com/Preet to start your free trial. No credit card required, and get a special offer. That's clio.com/Preet. CLIO.com/Preet. Sal Khan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Preet.
Right off the bat, let me just ask you this. How disappointed were your South Asian parents that you did not become a doctor?
It's actually a bit of a sore point. My mom still we made a couple of medical videos, and actually we had partnered with Stanford Medical School to do them. I'm 43 now. This was when Khan Academy had already become a real thing. I must have been about 36, 37 when my mom found out about those videos. She literally asked me whether I could now get a little credit for med school and maybe finish faster.
I'm
not joking.
Did you make? Oh, I know. When we talk about our parents, we're never joking. Did you do that in part to appease them?
In part, maybe, but it clearly did nothing. It just amplified the disappointment.
How'd you pick the name? It's so interesting. The name Khan Academy. How did you come up with that?
Hey, I'm actually quite sensitive about that because I actually used to make fun of. I used to make fun of people who would name things after themselves. I thought it was a very narcissistic thing to do. But in the early days of Khan Academy, before it was even called Khan Academy, when I was working with family members, I was writing software for them, and I wanted to call it something. This was before I'd even made YouTube videos, and a lot of domain names were already taken up, and the one thing that was available was Khan Academy. And the reason why I picked Academy, it was almost a joke. It was me and my family members, my last name, and then the Academy. I thought it would be nice if it all had an air of being something that could turn into an institution, and that's something that eventually I do want it to turn into. Another dimension of it, even when we incorporated it as a nonprofit, that actually was a reason in a pseudo-strategic way why I also wanted Khan there, because in a not-for-profit, I don't own any shares. There's no formal lever of control, but I thought, hey, at least if my name's on it, they would only fire me in an extreme circumstance.
Right, they would have to find another Khan, or they would have to change the name. That gets complicated. Although, but Khan Academy, it sounds cool and it works. If your name, if I had done this, I'm not sure Barara Academy would have worked. It's too many syllables.
I think it's got a ring to it.
But if you had a podcast, you might call it Stay Tuned with Preet. So I put my name in it also. So I also can't be fired.
No judgment. No judgment.
Be fired so
judge.
Easily. So, a lot of people may not be familiar with the amazing story of how Khan Academy started. So you disappointed your parents by not going to medical school. Maybe made them feel a little bit better by going to a hedge fund. And you're a hedge fund guy. And explain what happened.
Yeah, my real training and background was in tech. I was a CS guy, a computer science guy, an early part of my career. When the dot-com bubble popped in the late 90s, I went to business school. And then coming out of business school, I had ironically sworn off entrepreneurship because I thought I didn't have the stomach for it. And I said, let me do something, that's less economically sensitive. And so I had the bright idea of joining a very small hedge fund. It was me and my boss. But while I was doing that, this was now 2003, 2004, I had just gotten married. A family member, Nadia, she was 12 years old, had come up from New Orleans, which is where I was born and raised, to Boston for my wedding. And it just came out of conversation. She was having trouble in math. I offered to tutor her when she got back to New Orleans. She agreed, so I would just get on the phone with her. long story short, at first she just was convinced she wasn't capable of learning math. She had trouble with unit conversion. Then slowly but surely on the phone, I kind of deprogrammed her lack of self-confidence. Then she started to learn the math. She actually got caught up with her class, a little ahead of the class. And because of her perceived weakness, she had actually done quite badly on a standardized exam the previous year, and they had put her into a remedial math class. So once I saw that she had caught up and that she was ahead, I called up her school. I say I became something of a tiger cousin. And I called up her school and I said, I really think Nadia Rahman should be able to retake that placement test from last year. They said, "Who are you?" I'm her cousin. They somewhat surprisingly let her take it. And that same Nadia, who was in a remedial math class literally a few months before, was now being placed into an advanced math class. So I was hooked. It was a fun way for me to bond with a cousin, a family member who was about maybe 15 years younger than me at the time. Then I started working with her younger brothers. And over the next 2 years, I had moved out to California with our firm. And word got around the family that free tutoring is going on. And I found myself...
It's a bargain.
It's a good price, yes. Had a money-back guarantee. I had about 10, 15 cousins, family friends that I was tutoring every day after the markets closed. My wife at the time was a medical resident, so we didn't have kids at that point. So that's what I would do. And the early Khan Academy had nothing to do with videos. It was actually, I saw common patterns in my family members that the reason why they were struggling in, an algebra class, it had nothing to do with their innate intelligence, nothing to do with algebra. It was because they had accumulated gaps from 5th grade or 6th grade or 7th grade. And so I started writing software just for kicks that would help them practice some of those gaps so that they can really get that fluency, that proficiency, so that the algebra or whatever else didn't really take as much cognitive load. They didn't have to think about how do I divide decimals? How do I evaluate a negative exponent? And I saw that was really helping my family. And I used to show this off to all my friends at dinner parties and things. And I was actually at a dinner party. This was in November 2006. And the host, his name's Zulfikar Ramzan, I have to give him full credit. He said, "Well, this is all cool, Sal, but how are you actually scaling up your lessons?" And I said, I'm not. It's hard to do with 15 cousins and family friends that I was able to do just with Nadia and her brothers. And he said, "Well, why don't you record your lessons as videos and upload them onto YouTube for your family?" And I immediately thought it was a horrible idea. I thought, YouTube's for cats playing piano, not for serious mathematics. But I went home, got over the idea that it wasn't my idea, and gave it a shot. And my family famously gave me feedback that they liked me better on YouTube than in person. I think.
How'd that make you feel?
I reflected on it, and when I reflected, it actually made a lot of sense. I don't think they weren't saying that they don't appreciate me. I don't think they were saying. In fact, they did say they appreciate me, the interest that I was taking in them, etc., being a mentor. But what they were saying is, and I think we've all been there, the first time you're trying to learn something that you might find a little bit intimidating, a little bit stressful, it's actually sometimes stressful when there's a well-wisher, a cousin, a family friend, a tutor who's sitting next to you saying, "Hey, it makes sense, right? A leads to B leads to C." And you feel pressure to say, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." And then 5 hours later, you're trying to do it on your own. And you're like, "What did my cousin tell me? What did my tutor tell me? I forgot the steps." Or it might be you're embarrassed. You're a 14-year-old and you're a little shaky on your 5th grade math. You might be embarrassed telling your cousin or your tutor or your teacher that. But with these videos, there's no judgment. They're available to you whenever you need. You don't feel like you're wasting someone's time if you ask for it to repeat itself. You can get as many repeats as you want.
Right.
So I think that's what they were saying.
Can I ask you a question just about this, the effectiveness of just video in general? And it seems to me there's one principle of teaching and learning, that it's interactive. And if you don't understand something in a classroom or in another environment, you can ask a question and the teacher can alter from his or her, original lesson plan and spend some time. But if you have a video that's static and doesn't change and you can't be interactive, how do you make sure that that is as effective as it can be?
So I think there's different layers to it. I'm a big believer that interactivity is key in the learning process. That's why most of Khan Academy, even the early days, the story I just told you, I had started on the practice platform. That was the original Khan Academy, that through the practice and the immediate feedback, my cousins would learn better, that they could keep course correcting. The videos were really a supplement to that. And even today, most of our resources at Khan Academy are on the practice side of things, kind of and I'm happy to explain, kind of a mastery learning. Kids can learn at their own pace and fill in their gaps. But even the videos, it's funny, even when Zuli suggested it, I kind of had the same mindset. Well, I guess if someone's struggling with the practice, this might be a nice little explanation for them. I think the key is how someone's mind is primed going into a video or a lecture. I think if you're in a traditional lecture-based classroom, it's just kind of fed to you regardless of where you are. I think we've all experienced it. We've sat in lectures and we've zoned out, or we're like, hey, I'm lost, or I'm bored, or it's hard to really pay attention, especially when it's a 60-minute lecture, or in college, a 90-minute lecture. What's been interesting, and I really just fell into it, I remember that first video that I made on YouTube. I think it was a 15-minute video, and then YouTube rejected me because there was a limit at the time that it could only be a 10-minute video. So I was like, okay, I guess I have to explain all of algebra in 10-minute segments. And
yeah,
so,
piece of cake.
Piece of cake. But I realized, well, they didn't say I couldn't upload 100 videos. They just said they had to be less than 10 minutes each. And I think there was something very powerful about that. And I realized that actually the key nuggets of knowledge you could do in this kind of 3 to 10 minute range, and then just keep sequencing them. And there's something about that where the act of watching a video, it isn't like I'm going into the big lecture hall on my university and whatever the professor's going to say, I'm just going to take notes regardless of how interested I am in. A video, it's almost the act of clicking on is like, you have a question about that concept. So your mind is already primed. So I actually do think it's more analogous to asking a question about, hey, I'm still a little bit shaky on what happens in a case where two lines don't intersect. How do I solve that system of equations? Well, look, there's a video on exactly that question. And so I could click on that. So I think it's a little bit more of an active process. And then, of course, you can pause, repeat. You could watch it on double speed. You could watch it on half speed. There's comment section where people can answer their questions below it. So I won't claim that it can do all of what an interactive classroom can be. In fact, if anything, we view everything we do at Khan Academy as something that could hopefully enable a classroom to do higher order tasks. We don't view it as somehow a replacement for a classroom, but we think it can do a lot of the active, interactive type of learning as well.
Is there a sort of set of principles that applies to teaching all subjects, or is it a very different matter to try to teach concepts of math, algebra, for example, as you mentioned, versus history, versus science, versus something else?
I'm of the school of thought. There are some core principles that would apply to almost everything. The ones that I try to remind myself is, number one, if the person who is creating the content, and I think this is true of videos, but it's also even true if you're writing questions, if you're creating a software experience, but especially if you're doing videos or if you're giving a lecture, if you're not excited, if you're not genuinely excited about what you're about to talk about, no one else is going to be genuinely excited about it. Human beings are very, very sensitive to tone.
Bueller.
And it's
Bueller.
Exactly. Well, that's the first one. You have to be excited. And then I think the second one is you have to be, if you are stressed about it, that stress will also convey. So I have a lot of friends actually in the early days that I tried to be guest lecturers on Khan Academy. And when I would talk to them about their area of expertise, whether it was physics or chemistry or history, they are these passionate people. They're doing a PhD in the field. They're writing about it. But as soon as you turn on a recording device, or as soon as you put them in front of an audience, they kind of turned into that. They were so self-conscious about making a mistake that their passion didn't come through. They wanted to plan everything, but they were also planning away their passion. So I think that's the second element that's really important. So the first one is you've got to really care and be passionate. The second one is don't overthink it and plan out your passion and your personality. Be willing to let that show. Be a little bit quirky a little bit every now and then. I would say the third is make sure that folks are able to see how this fits into the universe. Almost anything is beautiful if you see, wow, this has implications on how the universe works, which is, from the day we were sentient, we're like, how does this thing work? This puzzle that we have found ourselves born into. And every topic is answering that question in some way, shape, or form. It's either trying to understand this mystery of like, what are we? That's the humanities, or like, what is this universe, this simulation, whatever you want to call it that we've fallen into. That's what the sciences and philosophy and spirituality are trying to address. So the more you can draw those connections, the better. So I think those are pretty true in almost any field.
Well, that's interesting because, one of the complaints that kids have in school is, how is this going to help me later? Trigonometry, what's the purpose of this? But I guess your point is that in every context, making it clear why this is important, even if you're not going to become a mathematician someday, or even if you're not going to become an astronomer, to understand how, things work in the cosmos will cause people to be more interested in what is being said. Is that something you think is lacking generally in education?
Yes, although I have a slight contrarian view, which is there's a mainstream view that okay, if a subject matter is kind of just delivered, people say, well, how's this going to matter in my later life? How's this going to matter for my economic well-being or getting a job? And I think there is a dimension of that. If you can say, hey, if you learn this, if you're interested in going into finance or computers, this is how bankers use this idea. This is how people in software use this idea. But I actually think an even more powerful notion is to expose the beauty of the ideas. I think, I could tell you, hey, this idea A is interesting because it might help you make money in 20 years. Yeah, that's kind of, or I could say, do you realize what idea A tells you about the universe? Doesn't that give you chills? Doesn't you? And I think there's a lot in mathematics, and actually in any subject, in science, where you're just like, oh my God, I did not realize that about the universe. When you're studying mathematics, it's almost, you are just scratching the surface about something kind of almost like a spiritual order of the universe that our human brains are only just starting to glimpse. What could be more exciting than that?
Do you think that that people's attention spans, and especially children's attention spans, have gotten less and it makes teaching harder? Or is it your view, which I like, that so long as the teacher has passion and relates it to why it's important in the world, that even the modern generation in which my kids are, that sees fast editing on videos and they play video games and everything is quick and short. Has that been a problem, the attention span waning, or is that a myth?
I'm not 100% sure. My gut sense is, for the most part, attention spans are probably, they might have gotten a little bit more scattered because of all of the, you jump on your phone and you're doing 5 different things and your brain is constantly saying, do I have another email? Let me check social media, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that can have a harmful effect. And I think before we started, I was talking about how I've started meditating. And it's almost the exact opposite of that. So it does get you a little bit more in the flow and focused. But I think the biggest factor isn't that. I think human beings, there's studies from well before social media and cell phones became a thing. This go back to the 70s and 80s. Some of these studies, I wrote about them in my book, is that when they studied students in a class, they're able to focus the first 10 or 15 minutes. Then they zone out for about 4 or 5 minutes. Then they zone in, but now when they zone in, they can't zone in 15 minutes. Now they might zone in 12 minutes or shorter, and then they zone out for a little bit longer. So that's actually a very natural phenomenon that you can really keep your focus for about 15 minutes, then you zone out. It's a very natural thing for the human brain to do. The reason why classes are 60 minutes or 90 minutes, despite some of that research, is just logistics. They're like, hey, we're taking all the trouble of scheduling people into a room. They have to switch classes. They have to move their bodies. They have to get their books out. So let's keep them there as long as they can without needing a bathroom break. I literally think that might be the design principle by which it was made. So I think all of us, if we go back when we were in school in the 80s and 90s, we all zoned out after 10 minutes, after 15 minutes, and we didn't have social media. We didn't have these other distractions. I think the difference now is kids today, you can almost say, they know what it's like to get something in a 10-minute dosage, and they're like, hey, that's actually a lot more, even learning is a lot more appealing in that dosage. And so when they go back to the 90-minute form factor, and if it's just passive and you have to sit there, when you know something that's a little bit easier to digest, you're going to have trouble taking the thing that is a little bit boring and passive. That's not to say that the class isn't incredibly valuable. All the teachers that I talk to love this, is that, look, now it doesn't have to be about passive information delivery when human beings get together. It should be about, what can the human beings do together? How do they teach each other? Can they have a Socratic dialogue? Can they do a project? Can they do a simulation?
You have a very optimistic view, which I like, and I hope is correct, but I want you to talk about it for a second. You say that everyone really innately wants to learn, virtually everyone. And it's not the case that we sometimes think, well, some people are not interested in learning, that often it's the failure of the teacher or the failure of the school or a failure of the institution or some other failure that doesn't tap into what I think you believe is an innate desire to learn and of curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, what I always point out is you give me a group of 3 and 4-year-olds. I don't care about their parents' education level, their income level, their race, their gender, or where they grew up. They are the same. Like if you bring any new object into the room, any 3 or 4-year-old, you literally have to fight them off. They want to explore it. no matter how mundane it could be, like a pink piece of plastic. They're going to they're going to do all sorts. So that is a very core thing that makes us human. I think, unfortunately, what happens is many times, once you go into a traditional system, and this is a system that kind of came out of the Industrial Revolution, a Victorian era where self-control was kind of the highest thing over even things like curiosity and creativity. Yeah, a lot of that, look straight, put your finger on your lips, and listen to what we got to say. If you want to move, is that too bad? You have to learn to control yourself. I think it gets worse for kids who might not have extra supports, because they might get into a system where it's a fixed pay system. Preet, you are my children. We are able to give them all of the benefits of a great preschool, all the benefits of tutoring them, and all sorts of enrichment activities. And if there's a group of kids who get that, and then a group of kids who aren't getting the preschool, who aren't getting the enrichment activities as early as kindergarten, it starts to hit their self-esteem. It starts to hit how the teachers perceive them. And once again, tone, human beings are very sensitive to it. And I think over time, that has a very big effect. A thought experiment I like to give people is, if you were to go back in time 400 years to Western Europe, you would have seen, which even then was one of the more literate parts of the planet, you would see about 15% of the population was literate, about 20% of men and 10% of women. And I suspect that if you went to someone who knew how to read, say a member of clergy, and said, what percentage of the population do you think is even capable of reading? They probably would have said, well, with a great education system, maybe 30%. And that would have been reasonable given that his context of that's optimistic in a world where only 15% can read today. And they probably would have said that, yeah, probably most of the population isn't capable of reading. But we did have mass public education that came out of the Industrial Revolution, which was a huge boon to society. And we now know that pretty close to 100% of the population is capable of reading. But if we go out to even fairly optimistic people, and I would ask, what percentage of the population is capable of being a member of the creative class, for lack of a better word, people who could be researchers, find the cure for cancer, be an entrepreneur, write the next great novel. I think a lot of folks would say, well, right now that's, give or take maybe 5% of the population. With a great education system, maybe it can be 10 or 15. But I think that's based on similar blinders that clergy member would have had 400 years ago, where today people say, well, I've seen a lot of my peers drop off the pipeline, so to speak, in that algebra class or that geometry class or that physics class, but what I believe is that, well, they dropped off because they had a gap in dividing decimals, which any human being can understand. They just need the time to really fill in that gap. And then the algebra would make all the sense in the world. And then they could keep going. And then the calculus would make all the sense in the world. I'm saying this in not as like, oh yeah, calculus was easy for me type of tone. When I really think about calculus, if you really go into calculus or physics or quantum, if you go into these with really, really strong background, they really aren't any more difficult than learning anything that came before it. It's just that people go into them with a lot of gaps in their foundation, which makes them really hard to tread. So I think if we allow people to learn at their own time and pace, master these concepts, I theoretically had been believing that you could get a much larger chunk of society to participate. And now at Khan Academy, almost every day we get 10, 20 letters, comments from people all over the world saying, I dropped out of high school. I thought I was no good. I re-engaged. Now I want to be an engineer because I realize how beautiful math is, or physics or chemistry or world history. And we're seeing that from a lot of folks that you wouldn't expect. In the last 2 weeks, I've gotten 2 handwritten letters from prisoners in the Florida correctional facilities saying how they've been able to get Khan Academy usage offline, how Khan Academy has kind of awakened their curiosity. I would argue awakened it again. Reading their words, I realize that these people are more excited about learning and the beauty of mathematics than even many people who are sitting in colleges or grad schools. So it's really just about filling in those gaps. And if these people, the most marginalized in society, can get excited, I'm pretty confident that it's like literacy, that pretty close to 100% could participate at that level.
You're absolutely right. And it applies in multiple contexts, that whether it's in a job setting or in school, you do a task or you try a project and you don't do a great job, and a view gets developed of you, and then you internalize it, and it becomes very hard to recover. I mean, we used to talk about that in a rarefied place like the U.S. Attorney's Office, that opinions about, rookie prosecutors were formed sometimes very early because somebody made some mistake on a case or didn't handle some oral argument particularly well, and that could have a crushing, even on these people who have amazing resumes and are amazingly talented, because they didn't have the room to have that, sort of setback, and everyone around them thought they were capable of only so much. And you have to work really hard on making sure that you're encouraging people in the right way. And so that leads me to my next question. You wrote something interesting once, and it made me think about my own family. The question of how we